Welcome, everyone. My name is Micah Schwartzman. I'm the director of the Karsh Center for Law and Democracy at the University of Virginia School of Law. The Karsh Center is a nonpartisan legal institute whose mission is to promote the understanding and appreciation of principles and practices necessary for a well-functioning pluralistic democracy, including civil discourse, civic engagement and citizenship, ethics and integrity in public office, and respect for the rule of law. I want to thank the Miller Center for sponsoring this program. I also want to recognize the University of Virginia's Institute of Democracy for supporting our efforts to understand what is happening in the aftermath of this presidential election. I want to introduce our panelists for today. I'm thrilled to have with us three people. Dan Ortiz, who's my colleague at the University of Virginia School of Law, is the Michael J. and Jane R. Horvitz Distinguished Professor of Law and the director of our Supreme Court Litigation Clinic. He teaches constitutional law, civil procedure, and election law, on which he has published widely. Mirna Perez is director of voting rights and election program at the Brennan Center for Justice, where she leads the program's research, advocacy, and litigation work nationwide. She's a lecturer at Columbia Law School and has served as an adjunct professor of clinical law at NYU School of Law. Bertrell Ross is Chancellor's Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, where he teaches election law, legislation, and constitutional law. His research, which integrates political theory and empirical social sciences, focuses on poverty and democratic politics. He's working on a book entitled What the Constitution Owes the Poor, Equal Protection, and a Path to Political Equality. I've asked our panelists for their thoughts on where we are in the aftermath of the presidential election. Media outlets have called the race for President-elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but President Trump, as you know, has refused to concede the election. Given that situation, we can ask questions in at least three areas. First, in terms of the election process, when will it be over? Do any of President Trump's lawsuits have any merit? Should we expect recounts? And if so, how long will they take? We all, I think, have lingering questions about what next steps will be in terms of litigating the election, which of course is the title for our panel. There are also questions about voting rights. What lessons should we draw from this election in terms of protecting voting rights and administering elections? How do we shore up the integrity of our electoral process? And at this point, there are questions about presidential transition. If President Trump refuses to concede, what legal and political consequences will that have? I'm going to give each of our panelists about 10 minutes to share some thoughts about these and other questions, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. If you do have questions, and I would encourage you to ask them, please enter them in the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen within Zoom. I'll then convey those questions to our panelists. I'm going to start with Dan Ortiz and ask him about where we are in litigating the outcome of the presidential election. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Micah, and thank you all for coming out for discussing such an interesting and timely subject. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time talking about the ongoing litigation, which is everywhere in the newspapers and the media, but is focused on only a few states. Nearly every close state has some litigation at this point, mostly small potato stuff, as President Trump himself complained. And only one case I think is potentially important or interesting, and I think even its chances are pretty dim. In general, the cases fall into several different types. One, there's a set of cases concerning poll watching issues. We saw these in Philadelphia and Nevada, where the Trump campaign or Republican groups are claiming they their poll watchers didn't have adequate access. There's another set of claims around ballot curing. You see this in Michigan, where same people are complaining that the poll workers are actually curing ballots and redoing ballots. Another set of cases concern bad voting instructions. The most prominent one here is the Sharpiegate, so-called Sharpiegate charge that poll workers in Arizona were actually instructing voters to fill out their voting forms with Sharpies, which the claim was the machines did not properly recognize. And then there are a whole bunch of issues around late ballot counting, particularly Pennsylvania. And there are several other suits that I think are maybe in the works. I mean, you hear the sort of groundwork being made for them, or at least the media being prepared. So I don't know if they'll actually result in lawsuits. To my mind, they're pretty far-fetched. One is this charge in Nevada that we've heard that Nevada has been accepting out-of-state ballots. And another concerns a more generalized claim that there was a surprising and possibly pointing to fraud, amount of undervoting. This is when people vote for the president, but not for any of the offices underneath. These lawsuits pretty much suffer from the same problems, either one of two different types. The first is that there really isn't much evidence to support them. The poll watching cases, for example, have usually gone off on Republicans having exactly the same kind of access as Democrats to watch the polls. And the claims around them have been pretty much COVID generated, that the election officials have tried to provide a little bit more distance between the poll watchers and the actual poll workers in the past. But these are pretty much now fading away and have been resolved just by consent. The other problem with them is that when there is evidence, there's usually no problem. So for example, the claim that Nevada is accepting out-of-state ballots may be true, but it's been pointed out that that's legal. Out-of-state students and military, other people have the right to send in their ballots from out-of-state. And there doesn't appear to be a surprising number of these. Ballot curing, the sort of Sharpie gate kind of stuff too, that's either pretty standard for poll workers to do that and is often necessary to actually count ballots properly, or in the Sharpie gate case, it was determined that the poll workers were advising that people use Sharpies rather than actual pens because it actually worked better to have their votes counted. And as for the undervoting, there is some evidence of that, but there's basically consistent with practices in the past, the 2016 presidential election, for example. And some of the claims just don't really make a lot of sense. So for example, if there was undervoting, you wouldn't want to stop at the Senate because, as everyone knows, the Senate is a pretty important institution at this point and is very closely balanced. And so if you were really engaging in this kind of fraudulent manipulation of the vote, and if you were thinking about it, you would actually have you'd have these people vote for many, or at least two offices, I think, further down the ballot before they stop. So the question is, if there's not really much evidence here, something going wrong, why is it being so hotly pursued, and people in these states pushing these actions? So it may not be successful at ultimately changing the vote. I doubt that's going to happen at all, but it may be successful for other kinds of reasons. Some people have suggested that it helps massage the ego of the loser. If he can leave claiming that he would have won if the election had not been stolen, and it may actually make it likelier that he would leave without taking a baseball bat to some of our institutions. Other people claim the purpose is really just to delegitimize the Biden administration coming up, and it might actually do some of that. And there's a third concern, which I think is it's going to turn out to be a little bit far-fetched and won't work, but it's still sort of possible. And there was some talk about it, I think, before the election, which is that it might encourage some mischief on the part of state legislatures. Now, let me explain this idea because I don't think it will be obvious to a lot of people. But if you can create uncertainty about the fairness of the vote in a few critical states, say Pennsylvania, maybe Arizona, and some others, you might be able to create some pressure on Republican legislatures there to use their quote-unquote authority under Article 2, Section 1, Paragraph 2, to directly appoint electors under the Constitution. And of course, if the state legislatures do that, they're being Republican in these cases, they would presumably appoint Republican electors, which would oppose the Democratic slate that would have been elected in the election itself. And then the legislature would presumably vote to certify those people, and they try to send them those votes to Congress for counting on January 6th. Now, in some of those states, you'd have the actual properly elected electors voting too, and presumably the Democratic governors in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin would certify them and send those votes into Congress as well. Now, the hope there, once these things get to Congress, might be that Congress would somehow accede to the legislatively appointed electors. And if there was some debate, there's something called the Electoral Count Act, which was enacted in the turmoil after the Hayes-Tilden election of 1876, which is supposedly designed to handle these kinds of situations. But it's really a mess, and no one really quite knows what it means, and it's never really been litigated. There are claims that you could make claims that it's unconstitutional under the so-called independent state legislature doctrine, and that's the issue that's currently pending in the Pennsylvania case that's before the Supreme Court. Or even without making a constitutional argument, Congress or one house of Congress could claim that although the Electoral Count Act was enacted pursuant to bicameralism and presentment, it's not a law, just a joint congressional rule, which can be abandoned by either house. And there's actually a little bit of evidence that it was understood that way way back in the 19th century. Now, even if Congress doesn't count the legislatively appointed votes, you could, if they rejected, say, both slates, then you could have a problem where the whole election would be thrown into the House of Representatives. And there, things get pretty messy. Each state has one vote, which is determined by the majority of the state delegation. And I think, most people who sort of looked at the votes would understand how that would go. So that said, I don't think there's actually much to worry about here. You'd have to have a lot of pressure to create state legislatures, enough critical ones to actually take this leap and override the Democratic vote in those states. Already, the leaders of the Pennsylvania state legislature have been seen to throw some cold water on the idea. It's not quite clear, but it appears to be what they're doing. And I doubt the Supreme Court is going to take the Pennsylvania case up, which would probably be necessary to give state legislatures sufficient cover to feel that they could do something like this. And also, I think it would go down pretty unpopularly with a lot of people. Not predicting rioting on the streets, but there might be something like that. In the moment I have left, I'd just like to suggest there might actually be something hopeful, good coming out of the mess that we're currently in. One, I think that it may be that people are going to be more attuned to voter suppression issues going forward and have a better understanding of how it works. I also think that the genies of mail-in voting and early in-person voting are probably out of the bottle. It's going to be hard to put them back very much. And I think also there may be new hope for ranked choice voting, which is a new voting system that's in place in a few areas. It's been traditionally opposed or resisted, let me put it that way, by Republicans. But with their experience with the libertarian, quote unquote, spoiler this time around, Joe Jorgensen, their views may change. And also it would prevent things like what I view as the insanity of the Georgia senatorial runoff at this point. It would have sort of handled that automatically. But I've used up my time and said my bit, so I'm happy to pass the baton.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to turn things over to Mirna.
Great, thank you. Buenas tardes, good afternoon. I'm Mirna Perez. I'm the director of the Voting Rights and Elections Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. We are named after the great Justice William Brennan, who made famous the idea of a living constitution, one that is not frozen in time, but rather adapts to the challenges. And we sure had a lot of challenges. So we spent a lot of time trying to interpret the Constitution and to put forward policies that made our democracy more robust and participatory and inclusive. I've broken up my 10 minutes into what we did, what we learned, and what we can expect in the future. So what we did, we had 35 states and DC change their laws or change their practices or laws in a substantive way to account for the pandemic. We had 11 states eliminate the excuse requirement for at least a November election and voting by mail. We had 5 states change their policy so that every voter that was eligible got a mail-in ballot without having to request for one. We had 11 states mail absentee ballot applications to voters. We had 6 states change the receipt date by which a timely ballot mailed would get counted. We had 8 states change their policies as to when voters would get an opportunity to fix technical defects. We had 7 states change the policies regarding who was able to have postage prepaid. We had 7 states expand their early voting hours. Why do I say this? Because I think we as voters and we as the bar and we as student activists should feel really, really good about the amount of work that we were able to accomplish in such a short period of time. But I think it also tells us how much we had to catch up, like how much our systems aren't built in a way to be responsive to a challenge of the moment, like a once in a century global pandemic. If our democracy was built in a way such that we had risks diversified and that we accounted for the fact that our communities are different and have differing needs, we might not have had to play catch up so quickly. So what did we learn? I think one of the big things we learned is that it took the potential widespread disenfranchisement of people who are usually not disenfranchised to move policy. I'm going to say that again because I know it's going to be provocative, but I think it took the potential of widespread disenfranchisement of people who are usually not disenfranchised to move policymakers into making our elections more resilient and to making sure that voters had more options. What are some of the ways in which I think we can attribute that? Well, some of it is anecdotal. We haven't seen these kind of changes happen this quickly in any of the 10 years or so that I have been studying litigation or election changes. I also know that in the last 2 months, I got more questions asked about how people voted if you were housing insecure than I had in my prior 15 years of practice. And it wasn't like we had used to do a great job with people who didn't have homes or were housing insecure, and all of a sudden we screwed it up. It's people are able to look at other folks and be able to say, look, wait, that could be me because life is hard right now and my housing situation is at risk. I think we saw a lot of changes making mail voting more accessible. Notwithstanding the fact that people of color have historically used mail voting at a much lower rate, and people of color are dying at a much higher rate from COVID and the other animating concerns behind these changes. So I think there was a giant wake-up call about how our democracy doesn't work for all of us in circumstances, and people were able to see that they could be the ones that were experiencing the disenfranchisement that people of color have been experiencing since the country founded. And that caused folks to be thinking, wait a minute, we need to figure out a way to make sure that we're not just a democracy for most of us, that we're a democracy for all of us. So that spurred a lot of changes. Second big lesson I think we learned is that litigation works, roughly half of the time. We have been tracking litigation since the pandemic. We're tracking about a little bit more than 330 cases. And there have been 269 that we have been tracking since the pandemic. And we've been breaking these cases up into what we would call pro-voter or expansive or anti-voter or restrictive lawsuits. And that, it turned out that there were more pro-voter lawsuits being filed, largely because legislatures were closed for business, right? And they weren't opening up. So if we were going to have election changes, we needed to have this done through like equitable relief of courts. But we also saw that in many instances, it didn't prevail. The states that were trying to expand access are a little bit higher than the states that were trying to restrict access. But many of the cases are still pending or awaiting final resolution. And so much of that was done on short-term preliminary injunctions that they weren't done with a full record. And it's not clear that those cases are going to be revisited in a thoughtful way to figure out if we got the policy right? To figure out if our constitutional principles are being adhered to in an appropriate way, to figure out if we are making good on the promise that this country made via the 15th Amendment, that when you step into that voting booth, you will be free from racial discrimination in voting. And it also served to be a vehicle, as Professor Ortiz noted, for other people's policy disputes to be able to play out in the judiciary. I would very much believe and very much advocate the idea that most of these lawsuits are completely frivolous, lacking evidence. They're not going to have that much legs. But I think we as officers of the court and we as law students and we as the academy need to be concerned about the court clog that is going to happen when you have courts being tied up with these kinds of frivolous cases or these distracting cases, these nuisance cases, and what it does to the judiciary as an institution when people see party apparatchiks using the court system as a way to be dilatory and worrying about what happens. We should all be concerned about the integrity of the judiciary and about the judiciary being lifted up as an opportunity, as the place for where we can get voting rights protected. And it should not be viewed in a cynical way where it is being played out as another arm of the political sphere. Like, I think that that is going to be harmful to the idea of the court as a check and balance. And we need to be worried about how those things worked out. I also think a third thing we learned is that intimidation is real. Misinformation and disinformation is very, very real. We didn't see these organized efforts of Proud Boys or groups that call themselves militias popping up at certain places, but we saw lots and lots of incidences of what I call randos with guns and trucks, like people blocking access to the ballot box, complaints of people being intimidating, complaints of people feeling like somebody was trying to police them or question them. And I had not seen the kinds of complaints that we'd gotten at the level that we saw in the last election. We also saw lots and lots of claims of police officers or constables not threading the needle appropriately between giving people the confidence that our drop boxes weren't going to get like set on fire and making sure that it was welcoming and hospitable. And I think we are going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to figure out the fact that our laws have not calibrated the kind of balance that we need to make sure that all of our needs are being protected. So what do we need to do? One, we need to invest in our elections in a very real way. Even under the best of circumstances, our elections are underfunded and under-resourced. Part of the reason we saw so many wonderful changes was because we had to play catch up, because we were busy scrambling for ways to make sure that our system was open. And it is to our detriment to not think about building those resiliencies and that contingency plan in place, because this year it was a once in a century pandemic. In another year, it could be foreign cyber criminals crippling our infrastructure. And another year, it could be weather. Elections are so important that we need to make sure that they exist as a peaceable way to resolve political differences, which means we need to be able to handle and be ready for whatever challenge the moment throws at us. Two, we need to pass a Restored Voting Rights Act. I think it is indisputable that much of the voter suppression we saw came from there being fewer federal protections against it, and the belief that they would get a sympathetic court if for politicians that wanted to push the envelope to see how far they would get away with. Three, we need to pass the For the People Act, which would set minimum floors for how elections need to be run. It says we have a system that states run our elections. I think it allows for a lot of opportunities to innovate and to encourage a race to the top, but we do need a floor. And then finally, and I think this is going to be really hard for a lot of lawyers, we need to make the case for democracy every day. We need to not be expecting our courts to be able to protect our rights. We need to be explaining to average Americans, like, why is it that our democracy works best when it hears from all of us? Why is it that we are not going to be able to get ourselves out of the challenges that we find ourselves in these days unless we're able to leverage the experience and the talent and the expertise that people have about their own lives and what they need from government and what they need from politicians and what they need to keep themselves and their families safe and healthy. I think it has become extraordinarily obvious that only in rarefied airs do people understand, the way the Electoral College works and why you could have a case on one topic in federal courts and another in state courts. Why is it that there are these things called canvassing and certifications? Why does the media not get to be the one that calls who won or who doesn't win? Like, I think we have a real deficit in knowledge about the nuts and bolts of how our democracy works. And I think that that is our fault. I think it has happened on our watch that we are not educating the public, that we're talking too much to ourselves, that we are not making sure that students get good civics education, and that we're not explaining every single day that in order for our democracy to live up to our ideals, it needs to be robust and participatory and inclusive.
Thanks, Myrna. Bertrand, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So I know our roles as lawyers is to identify problems and to fix them. And I think that that's a critical role that we play. But I want to spend a little bit of time today celebrating this election. It was far from perfect, and maybe I had extraordinarily low expectations about how this was going to go, but it went a lot better than I expected. We're running an election in the middle of a pandemic. We ran an election in the context of threats to the integrity of the process, threats to man the polls with individuals who would deter people from voting. We had fears of violence at the polls that might occur. We had concerns about whether mail-in ballots would be received and counted properly, how long this election would take to be resolved. And I know it took longer than people wanted in terms of networks calling the elections, but they ultimately did, of course, on Saturday. But the low expectations I came in here with, we far exceeded them. I think that states made extraordinary adjustments in a short amount of time to come up with an electoral system that was responsive to the context. Now, maybe this should have been done, as Myrna says, a long time ago, and I think that that's absolutely right. But the fact that states and counties and localities were able to make these adjustments shows what we can do to improve our electoral system. It shows what is possible if given the right incentives and the right resources to adjust elections to account for the needs of our democracy. So I think that it's worth to point those things out to celebrate aspects of the election that perhaps get overlooked, and the anxiety that people are feeling, whether it's glee about who potentially won or disappointment about who potentially lost, to recognize that our democracy survived a huge challenge. Not to say, again, that there doesn't need to be many things more done. There certainly does, but we did see, it shows the resilience of our democracy, which I'm quite proud of. Now, what I want to kind of focus on in terms of what should we draw from this election in terms of protecting voting rights? Well, what we should draw from this is that when you open up more opportunities to vote, it suggests that it might be harder to suppress the vote. When you provide opportunities to mail in your ballots, to vote early, and to vote in person on election day, it decentralizes or diffuses the possibilities by which individuals can suppress the vote. It makes it a lot harder to do so. And so one of the things that I learned from this is that making voting more easier and accessible in these ways can be a way to combat efforts that one party or campaign or set of individuals might have to suppress the vote. Now, in terms of the mail-in ballot system, the mail-in ballot system was something that was one of the adjustments that many states, in a sense, made on the fly. States did not know how to deal with this level of massive number of mail-in ballots. States like Pennsylvania, which didn't have a history of doing this, and many others. Now, thinking about sort of how the system held up, I think it held up remarkably well. There were certainly a few minor hiccups, including county registrars sending the wrong or defective ballots to certain voters that were corrected. There were also the challenges associated with the United States Postal Service delivery of ballots. And finally, there was the controversy and litigation surrounding the question of when ballots have to be received in order to be counted, a dispute between a requirement that ballots be received on election day, which due to the vagaries of postal delivery during this election led to uncertainty about when ballots would have to be mailed in order to be received on time. And then on the other side, there was a requirement that ballots be postmarked by election day, which reduced voter uncertainty about whether their ballots would be counted if sent by a specified day, but extended the vote counting process by a couple of days beyond the election. Overall, however, we saw that states, including those with little experience dealing with the massive numbers of mail-in ballots, generally did an outstanding job of informing the public about the mail-in balloting process, even as they changed and were altered by court decisions in a few instances. And we saw a huge number of voters take advantage of this more accessible and safe voting process during a pandemic. And we also saw a vote counting process that was remarkably efficient. I know that waiting until Saturday morning for a result was painful to many, but it takes time to process and count mail-in ballots in states like Pennsylvania that prohibited the processing of mail-in ballots on election day were at a severe disadvantage in the counting process. Yet the counting process in Pennsylvania and other states with similar rules was complete enough to declare a winner 4 days after the election. Now, as a comparison, it took Pennsylvania 14 days to complete the counting process in the primary elections in June, with many fewer mail-in ballots. So again, I think that represents a success. But unfortunately, I do not anticipate, despite the success of mail-in voting, that there will be widespread adoption of mail-in voting. The reason is because I think people will think that based on this election, that mail-in voting advantages one party over the other. Historically, this has not been true, as absentee ballots in elections prior to this one often favor Republicans over Democrats. But the combination of President Trump and the Trump campaign so far baseless assertions that mail-in voting is infected with fraud, and the fact that the decision of Democrats to mostly vote by mail and Republicans to mostly vote in person, with the encouragement of their party leaders, could reinforce a narrative that mail-in balloting is good for Democrats and bad for Republicans. And we know that once that narrative takes hold, it is hard to achieve reform in the absence of unified partisan government at the state level. Now, in terms of thinking about what might happen in the future, we have two potential scenarios that could arise in the future, depending on what happens in the runoff elections in Georgia on January 5th. First, we can have divided government, and that's what many anticipate, in which the Republicans can maintain control of the Senate, the Democrats control the House and the presidency. Or we could have unified government if Democrats won both runoff election, in which the Democrats would have control of the Senate due to the tiebreaker vote of Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, as well as control of the House and the Senate. Now, if the GOP, the Republicans maintain control of the Senate, it will be tough sledding on election reform in the future. And Democrats will have to consider whether they want to make a trade with Republicans that involve perhaps adopting a national mail-in voting system or some other minimum standard for voting that would make it easier for individuals to vote in exchange for something that Republicans want, which may be a national voter ID mandate or mandatory voter roll purges under certain conditions. Both of these latter proposals designed to address fraud that social scientists have found to be quite rare and could also would probably lead to the suppression of votes. Now, that could be the type of trade proposed, but I just don't see something like that going anywhere, as the base of both parties would rebel against concessions made to the other. Another possibility that Myrna raised is the revival of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was rendered moot by a decision called Shelby County, decided back in 2013. This provision required that states that had a history of discrimination obtain approval from the federal government before making changes to their electoral system. Now, in a divided Congress, Congress and presidency, I don't see that moving forward. In fact, I sense that Democrats have some misgivings about reviving Section 5 because of the provisions implicating redistricting and the legal justification they might provide for packing voters of color into small numbers of districts, which facilitate Republican control of surrounding mostly white districts. Now, if the Democrats somehow won the two runoffs in Georgia, then that could open the door for broader, more far-reaching policy. Now, this could include something like a national absentee ballot system without the trade-off of national voter ID laws or voter purge requirements. It also might lead Democrats to push for those states who have not adopted redistricting commissions to adopt them. Now, one thing to remember about this election that has been overlooked is that the Republicans were quite successful in state legislative races. And what that means is that they will control the redistricting process in many states. It will engage in the same gerrymandering practices from 2010 that allowed them to maintain durable control of the chamber even during elections where more voters supported Democrat House candidates than Republican House candidates nationwide. A federal redistricting commission mandate would be one way to counteract the impending Republican gerrymandering, but it would be challenged in court, and that challenge might be successful based on an opening provided in a dissent by Chief Justice Roberts in the 2014 case of Arizona State Legislature v. Arizona Redistricting Commission, in which he argued that only legislatures can draw districts, not independent redistricting commissions. But assuming the decision to establish state redistricting commissions would stand, I think that that would be the most effective reform that Democrats could pass to ensure the fairness of elections if they gain control of the Senate. Now, there's a lot ahead of us in terms of democratic reform. I'm not sure how high this will be on the agenda of Democrats, given the many other challenges this country faces, including a pandemic that is killing thousands of people, more than 1,000 people by the day recently. But I think that electoral reform would be something that would be very productive for our democracy. It would allow for elections that would be less stress-inducing, less angst-ridden. It would provide greater access for individuals to vote, and maybe take down the temperature of our electoral environment by reducing structural features of our democracy that encourage polarization. So that's kind of what I'm looking at in terms of this election and looking ahead, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Bertal, and thanks for a great set of comments from all of you. We've got a lot to think about. I've got a decent queue for questions, but if you're out there and you've got questions, you can include them in the Q&A function. Well, let me start with a question that returns us to Dan's initial comments, and this question is about the merits of some of the lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign. The question is, are any of the litigating results for individual states likely to change the result from one candidate to the other? This is just with respect to the presidential election.
I don't see that. I don't see them even being successful, but even if they were successful, I don't think they're going to be changing enough numbers around at this point to make a difference, which is one of the reasons why I think it's very unlikely that the Supreme Court, even though some justices may be interested in taking up the Pennsylvania case, wouldn't go there.
So here's a question building on that one. This is from Nick Almendarez, who was the program director last year for the Karsh Center and is now in legal academia. He asks, how would you assess the media's overall handling of explaining that many or most of these litigating claims have little merit?
I would say that I think the media has done a very good job of explaining to voters what's at stake, for making sure that voters have avenues for getting information. One of the things that the media did poorly is nationalize isolated problems. I cannot tell you how many times I was on a radio show when a voter would call in and say, oh, I'm really worried that my mail ballot is not going to count because of signature matching. And they were in a state that doesn't have a robust signature matching requirement. Or, oh, I'm really worried that the Proud Boys are going to show up at the polls when they live in a state where there's a lot of protections to make sure that there's a big venue, a big space, a big cushion between where voters are voting and where people can be protesting. And so I think we need to do a better job of right-sizing the worry as opposed to what I was calling the doom spiral of everything that could go wrong. Like, I felt like reporters were treating, the elections as if they were some law school, like blue book exam where they were looking for hypotheticals about what could happen, as opposed to actually assess, well, what was the propensity? What was the likelihood? And I'm grateful that they didn't call the election prematurely. I'm grateful that people were actually explaining things like there's an electoral college and there's a canvassing deadline and the like. But I do think that we need to make sure that the media doesn't needlessly scare voters without making an accurate assessment as to what the potentialities were. And that was where I thought the missing piece was.
I guess I'll say in terms of this, what the media reports suggest in terms of this litigation is the challenge with the polarized, stratified media. Certain media sources are providing, I think, expert-driven analysis in which they're bringing legal experts on to their programs to provide a sense of what this litigation, what's the basis of these claims. But others are still operating in more of the opinion mode, in which they're not really looking closely at the litigation, but instead looking at the rhetoric surrounding the litigation, which is not often written into the actual suits or documents that they're presenting to the court. And so separating out the political rhetoric, which is designed to rally the base of Trump supporters, at least with respect to this litigation, from what's actually being litigated, is one of the challenges I see media as having. But some media are navigating it quite well, but others are not.
Yeah, one small change I've noted, and I'd be interested in hearing from others if they think it's occurred too, is with when it comes to the mainstream media, I seem to have noticed a change in tone from before the election until after the election. So as before the election, you tended to get the reporters saying, well, one side claims and the other side claims this. It's kind of like level playing field without making any kind of independent judgment about whether the claims were sustainable or not. And then as time has gone on since the election, what I've been here, I think I'm hearing, is more, well, this lawsuit was brought with these claims which are factually unsupported, or this has been determined not to be true, you know, that kind of thing. And I think that that actually, if it's true, I'm persuading myself and living in my own bubble, but I think if that is true, that's a very healthy sign.
Can I ask you a follow-up question about the presidential transition? So President Trump hasn't conceded the election at this point, and the Washington Post reports yesterday that the director of the General Services Administration has refused to, quote unquote, ascertain the victor of the election, which means that federal money that is designated for the presidential transition won't be allocated to the incoming Biden transition team. At least not until the president recognizes the outcome of the election. What if anything, should be the response to the current administration's refusal to concede? What legal or political implications does it have over the next several weeks or even several months? That's a question for any of you who might want to address it.
I mean, I think the big thing is the resource implications, because there's a lot of money wrapped up into the transition process that the General Services Administration, if they ascertain that Biden was a winner, would be able to release those funds to the Biden transition team so that they can engage in this transition process. And we're in a bit of unprecedented grounds in the sense that, you know, the General Services Administration could wait until Congress certifies who won the Electoral College vote, which doesn't happen until early January, which would leave very little time to engage in a transition process that's supported by the resources of the federal government. And that would be quite troubling and damaging given the challenges that the Biden administration is going to enter into, including, again, the pandemic, for which transition resources would be quite valuable. I don't know if the Biden team has any legal basis or viable legal claim against the General Service Administrator holding up these funds, given that, you know, until Congress ultimately counts and determines the Electoral College vote winner, we do not have a certified winner of the election. So I'm not as sure about that, but that would be a troubling precedent for the General Service Administrator to set that would, again, handcuff and hamstring the new Biden administration.
Yeah, I think just to further Bertrand's point, it's not only a danger to the Biden administration, it's going to be a danger to the country as well. It affects not only the funds, as Bertrand has pointed out, but also the ability of people in the incoming Biden administration to communicate with their predecessors, to find out what emergencies may be on the radar, from terrorism to whatever. I mean, it's just, especially when the Secretary of Defense was just fired. I mean, what kind of a world are we going to be in? It also is going to mean that the Biden administration can't work with the FBI to conduct investigations on probable nominees for top-level administrative positions, which is going to mean it's going to take a lot more time to settle that and just get people in place. There might be a legal claim, it'll be a hard one, under the Administrative Procedure Act, saying that the person in GSA who is refusing to officially make the ascertainment judgment is acting arbitrarily and capriciously. Usually it's easier to make those kinds of claims when someone actually acts rather than refuses to act, but there might be some legal leverage there.
And I would just say we don't want to be in a position where, because we are lawyers, that we see only legal solutions. I think just because you have a hammer doesn't mean everything is a nail. I think if there is an outcry of public demands for enough being enough, and that we want people to behave like a bunch of grown-ups in all of this, I think that that'll go a long way. We also need to remember this is not Biden's people's first rodeo. They certainly know their way around DC. So again, I'm hopeful that Americans of all political stripes come to a place where we decide these are what the rules are, and win or lose, we want to be playing by them, because I think the voters are going to be really hard to ignore in this circumstance.
I think there's also, from a crass political point of view, I think the Republicans may realize that what goes around comes around, and that if this precedent is set in future transitions, they could be gored by it too.
I've got a series of questions about electoral reform. So let me ask you a few of these, starting with one from Mirna. And this question is, do you think the early voting, no question absentee ballots will stay for the long run? I know Bertrand also mentioned the polarization of mail-in ballots. So I think initially for Mirna, this question about early voting and absentee ballots, but more generally, will the form that we vote in, on the ballot structure, will this most recent election have lasting effects?
Well, I think this most recent election provides us data, as it should. Like our elections are supposed to be dynamic, right? We're supposed to learn from things that went wrong. We're not supposed to continue to do things and provide vast customer service. That would be foolish. So my hope is that people are going to be able to assess what worked, what didn't, and make decisions about what's best for their country. I think it's going to be really hard for states to say that, the universe will collapse if we expand vote by mail opportunities, because it didn't. But I do think we can ask questions about, when we want certain rules to take place, and what sort of checks and balances do we want in the system. I think one of the things that we don't do is fund our elections enough so that we can actually do the study and analysis to figure out how we want to do things differently. I think that if we cared about the idea of elections and voters as a customer service model, like if we thought about this is the way in which voters are interacting with their government, and that voters should be able to have a pleasant experience when doing it, and that it should be minimally invasive and minimal imposition, then I think that would really change how we approach our elections. Early voting is super popular, and it's popular in red states and blue states and purple states. And I think states are going to be looking at these things and figuring out what they need to do. One of the things that I think is really challenging is that we don't get good data from elections. We don't get it enough. There's some states that are proactive about it and do it in almost real time. Other states, you have to file public records requests and keep hammering them until they return. Other states like Virginia make you be a resident before you can apply for a public records request. So I think, improving the data, making sure that we understand that elections are dynamic and that we should be trying to think about how to build a better mousetrap every time, and providing the professionalization and the resources and the funding to make sure that election administrators are able to do a top-notch job, I think are all really important, and that voters can demand that. I think that's one of the things that we need to remember. Voters can demand that we have free, fair, and accessible elections. We can say that we are not going to tolerate politicians manipulating the rules of the game so that some of us can participate and some of us can't. We are not going to tolerate long lines or crummy public information or misinformation. And I am hoping as Bertrand mentioned, that people realize the power that they exhibited here and what we were able to overcome, and not to forget what that feels like and how much better we are when people are participating.
I think for me, I think a lot will turn on how much this narrative of a stolen election takes hold. And if we can avoid that narrative from taking hold by providing factual information about what happened and the degree of fraud that existed, if any, then I think that there's immense possibilities with respect to maintaining and even expanding absentee voting opportunities, making early voting easier and such. But if that narrative of the election as being stolen does take hold, then all of these issues become partisan, polarized, and based on partisan calculations. And there will be one side who will seek to push back and resist reforms that they see as favoring the other side on the basis of a notion of election integrity and fraud concerns. I think if that's kind of the challenge that we're looking for in the next, couple of years going ahead to the next election. But I'm hoping, I'm cautiously optimistic, but we'll see. It will turn, these next couple of weeks will be pivotal in terms of how strong that narrative ends up being.
I agree completely with Marina and Bertrand. I think, though, that there probably are some very fundamental features of our democratic system that are really anti-democratic or undemocratic and are unreformable. I think we have to keep those in mind. There's not much we can do about from this point. But for example, the Electoral College, I see as a profoundly anti-democratic institution, but there's no way we're going to push it out of the picture and change it at this point. It'd be like from a small state's point of view, it'd be like the turkeys voting for Thanksgiving dinner. Similarly, I think the Senate is a very anti-democratic institution as well, and we're sort of seeing some of the implications of that right now. But practically speaking, that's unreformable. So I agree. I hope that a lot of change can come out of this election. Like Bertrand, I'm very happy that things worked out better than we had expected or feared. But I think we should keep our eyes on all the bad things that could have happened and perhaps almost did, and focus on what we can work to change.
There's some questions about online voting, and I wonder if any of you want to take up this issue. Is it possible? Is there any likelihood it will happen?
Not anytime soon. Like, there is no serious technologist that doesn't have a financial stake in this that believes that we can do this safely now. There are plenty of people that talk about blockchains and all this other stuff that say that we can do it, but there is no serious technologist who is financially disinterested who thinks that we can do online voting right now. I think we can and we should be experimenting more with letting people register to vote online, making sure that people can do lookups online, making sure that people can change their address updates online. I think there are a lot of ways in which we can and should be leveraging our technology to work for us, and we're not doing that yet, but that is a very, very big leap to actually online voting.
Yeah, Mike, I think we're moving in the opposite direction, actually. It used to be that 10, 15, 20 years ago, we had touch voting and electronic voting and things like that. And now, we're back to filling out pieces of paper and putting them through machines. This is, just underlines the kind of security concerns that Myrna is pointing to.
Well, I think there are lots of questions about voting processes, but let me ask you one about possible reforms. So we've got a situation now where it's not entirely clear who will control the Senate. There are two runoffs in Georgia that might be outcome determinative for that. Imagine that Republicans retain control of the Senate. Are there any voting reform possibilities that might still go through where Democrats and Republicans could still agree on making some changes to improve the integrity of our electoral system for the next time around?
Mike, I'm going to beat you up for being too reductionist. The answer is not whether or not we can pass it. It's whether or not we should be making the public case for it so that over time we can be able to be explaining and educating people why our democracy works best when it's more inclusive. Certainly folks who, like me, who are in the business of advocacy are going to try our darndest. HR 1, as the Speaker Pelosi has said, is going to be introduced I'm going to be doing everything I can to pass the Voting Rights Act. But I think what we're forgetting is the educative function that this advocacy serves, not only in terms of educating the public, but educating the members. Change is not going to happen in one legislative session. And back to where I started about having to make the public case for why we want an inclusive democracy, I think we should be playing the long game and not be assuming that an outcome here or an outcome there, a passage here or a passage there is the end of it. Because even when it is, we get rollbacks, right? Like this is something we have to do every day, especially as educators. We need to be constantly selling the idea of a robust and participatory democracy.
And to build off Myrna's point, I think that part of the educating function is the role of the federal government. We have kind of confusion sometimes amongst the American people and voters as to who's responsible for our voting systems. And for the most part, the states have taken on primary responsibility, but there is a role for Congress that's embedded within the Constitution. And I think that understanding what role the federal government can play, what support the federal government can provide with respect to voting systems that exist in the state, can potentially lead to a rallying of support of some sort of nationalization and standardization of voting practices that will allow for voting to be more easy, accessible, and understandable by the American people. So I totally support and agree with what Myrna is saying. Even if there is a divided Congress, divided government in which we may not have much hope in the immediate period for legislative change, to the extent that we have the people that are involved in the process of thinking through these things and mobilizing and supporting change, then that could change the dynamic fundamentally in Congress. It can lead to reforms even in the near future.
Yeah, no, just to build out even a little further from Myrna and Bertrand's comments, one of the, I think, missed opportunities of this election is going to be that elections in general, for all their importance, are also very important educational opportunities. And I think because of the likely political dynamic between the Senate and the administration after January, that immediate opportunity is going to be missed. And so I'm hoping that there are some maybe longer term lessons that we take from this, and that by continuing to educate people, we can actually eventually effectuate some change on the ground. But I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
Bertrand, I think this is a question headed your way. It says, some states collect voting data based on political party. Do you think that's a good idea? How much, if at all, do you think it influences voting for candidates with highest or lowest early reported vote?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really complicated issue in terms of the collection of partisan data. I think it could be helpful in this respect. It could give individual or campaigns more information about the tendencies and orientation of infrequent and non-voters, and maybe gives those parties and campaigns more incentives to reach out and connect with these individuals. To the extent that we can have more campaigns like what we saw in Georgia, Stacey Abrams' Georgia project, voter project, that really led to the mobilization of infrequent non-voters. I think it's helpful to have that information available because it creates better incentives to do so. But one thing I worry about with respect to the use of partisanship and party in the calculus is that it may lead to less efforts to persuade or engage voters of other parties. And that could lead to further polarization and undercutting the opportunity for unity and connectedness in the election season that I would like to see more of during in our electoral process.
All of you have talked in one way or another about the importance of education related to the election. And some of our questions from the audience also go to civics education. People are worried that many citizens don't know very much about how our government works. And there are lots of questions about parts of the government that we didn't even realize were going to be important. Who had read the Presidential Transition Act of 1963? Who knew about all of these various ballot procedures that are now being litigated? I suppose we just have about a minute left. On our way out, I suppose I'd ask you, what are your biggest priorities in terms of educating the public? What things do you most want Americans out there to know about their electoral system? Any takers?
It's your system. Like, it's your system, make it work for you. Like, if you are not, you shouldn't be a bystander. You should not expect the courts to save us. You should not be expecting politicians to do things because of a like abstract obligation, but rather you need to take the power that you have in your vote and make it work for you and make it work for others. And I think that this, the only way we are getting our country out of the mess that we find ourselves in is if voters decide that we're going to do it. I think our institutions of power are showing their limits and have showing the ways in which they don't include all of us. And so, vote.
I think it's a great way to end. Let me thank all of you, Dan, Myrna, Bertrall, for an excellent discussion and for taking all of these questions. I again appreciate the support of the Miller Center and Virginia's Institute of Democracy. On behalf of the Karsh Center, I want to thank all of you for joining us for this discussion of the aftermath of our presidential election. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.